November 25th, 1984, a Sunday in London. 13 of the biggest stars of the decade walked through the same studio door within 24 hours. One arrived on Concorde. Two arrived in a beat-up Volkswagen. One set up his own drum kit. Two of them would die on back-to-back Christmases, 32 years later. And the man who sang Feed the World spent decades quietly starving on his own demon. Give me 15 minutes. Some of this you've never heard. George Michael. He was 21 years old. 21. And when he walked into Sarm West Studios that Sunday morning, he was arguably the most famous young man in Britain. Wham was everywhere. Careless Whisper was climbing, and Bob Geldof had personally called to say, "We need your voice on this." He sang the hook, "Feed the world, let them know it's Christmas time." That line, the one every English-speaking person alive remembers, that's him and Boy George trading it back and forth. He was reportedly nervous that day, shy. Standing in a room with Sting and Phil Collins and David Bowie's friends, and he was still, in his own head, just a kid from East Finchley named Georgios Panayiotou.
Some really bad mistakes the last 3 or 4 years. There are certainly things
Here's what nobody in that studio knew. Here's what George didn't even fully know yet. The man singing Feed the World would spend the next 30 years quietly starving himself.
These songs from it come in at these staggering heights of 180 something.
Of peace, of privacy, of the one thing fame can never buy back. He lost his partner Anselmo Filippa to an HIV-related death in 1993. He spiraled into substance abuse he barely talked about publicly. He feuded with his record label for most of the 90s. And then, in secret, he gave away tens of millions of pounds to strangers. Nurses paying off IVF debts. Waitresses drowning in student loans. He never announced it. The stories only came out after he was gone. And then, Christmas Day, 2016. Heart disease. Fatty liver. He was 53 years old. The hook he sang at 21 outlived him by decades. His voice is on the 2024 Ultimate Mix, but he never got to hear himself on it. That's the first one. But the man standing next to George at the microphone, he nearly didn't make it to the session at all. And what happened to him afterward is almost stranger. Marilyn. Some accounts say he wasn't even invited, that he just showed up in a yellow tracksuit because Boy George was there. And wherever Boy George was in 1984, Peter Robinson, known
Dress up as Boy George.
known to the world as Marilyn, tended to appear. He was 22 years old, Jamaican-born, London-raised, beautiful in a way that made cameras fall in love with him. His single, Calling Your Name, had been a top 5 hit earlier that year. He was supposed to be the next big androgynous star. Not a copy of Boy George, something stranger. Something that, had the timing been different, might have made him a legend. Then the timing got very, very different. Here's what happened. The hits stopped.
More involved and become more controlling.
The label cooled. And Marilyn, who by some reports had been burned through more than £1 million by the end of the decade through bad management and people he trusted, fell into heroin. Then crack. Then a kind of disappearance that lasted the better part of 20 years. There are stories, some of them his own, about applying for a job at Tesco and being turned down because the manager recognized him and thought it was a joke. About living on benefits. About years when he barely left his flat. About friends from the 1984 session who had no idea if he was alive. He was, barely. And then, slowly, he came back. Music, writing. A 2025 interview where he talked about working with Boy George again. Clean, older, quieter. The yellow tracksuit long gone. The voice still there. 63 years old now. Proof that some comebacks take 20 years and are worth every day of the wait. That's 3 singers. Now meet the man who organized all of it and nearly broke himself doing it. Boy George. He was in New York when Geldof called. New York! The session was in London, starting the next morning. And Boy George, George Allen O'Dowd, 23 years old, the face on every magazine cover that year, was an ocean away. So he got on Concorde. Not a regular flight, Concorde. And he arrived late, fashionably late, and walked into a room full of people who'd been singing without him for hours. And then he opened his mouth, and the song became his. Culture Club was at its absolute peak. Karma Chameleon had owned the summer of '83. He was everywhere. MTV, the covers, the talk shows. Androgynous, unafraid, Irish Cockney working class, and somehow the most unlikely pop star the UK had ever produced.
The hair, they took off their false eyebrows and basically made a real compromise. But
Here's what the decade did to him. The addictions everybody whispered about became public. The arrests became headlines. There was a period in the mid-2000s where the tabloids seemed to be writing his obituary weekly. He went to rehab multiple times, lost people close to him, and nearly lost himself. But he came back. That's the thing about George. He always came back. Culture club reunions, the musical Taboo, DJing in clubs across Europe, reality television where he played versions of himself. And in the last few years, a renewed friendship with an old flame from the club scene and a songwriting partnership that nobody saw coming. Alive today, age 64, net worth somewhere between 10 and 50 million pounds, depending on who you ask. Still touring. And that old flame, that old friend from the club scene, the one now co-writing with him, he's the next name on this list. And his story is the darkest of all of them. Bob Geldof. He was 33, Irish, the frontman of the Boomtown Rats, which by 1984 was a band well past its peak. On paper, he was the least famous name in the studio that day. In reality, he was the reason anyone was in the studio at all. He'd seen a BBC News report, Michael Burke reporting from Ethiopia, famine, children dying on camera. And Bob Geldof did what almost nobody does after watching the news. He actually did something about it. He called Midge Ure. They wrote the song in a weekend, and then Geldof picked up the phone and called every star he could reach and leaned on them until they said yes. Here's what you have to understand. Nobody had ever done this before. The concept of a pop supergroup recording a charity single, that didn't exist on November 24th, 1984. It existed by November 26th because of him. Live Aid followed the next summer. Then the knighthood, then decades of activism that would have been a full life for most men. But Geldof's private life was another story entirely. His wife, Paula Yates, left him for Michael Hutchence of INXS in 1995. Hutchence died in 1997. Paula died in 2000. Their daughter Peaches died in 2014. The same cycle of grief that drives men into early graves. Geldof didn't go into an early grave. He kept organizing, kept calling, kept raising money. Alive today at 74, net worth estimated north of 50 million pounds, most of which he spent on causes rather than possession. And he died on Christmas Eve. Jody Watley. She was the outsider, the American in a room full of Brits. 25 years old, from Chicago, just starting her solo career after leaving the group Shalimar. And somehow she'd ended up in a London studio singing on the biggest pop single of the decade.
After You, the jazz song for the Red Hot and Blue project.
She'd gotten the call through her London connections. The session was fast, the energy was electric, and Jody Watley, the only black American woman in the core session by most accounts, brought an R&B flavor that the rest of the room simply couldn't provide. 3 years later, she had a Grammy. Looking for a New Love went platinum. Her self-titled debut album made her one of the biggest breakthrough artists of 1987, and she won Best New Artist at the Grammys that year, beating, among others, Terrence Trent D'Arby and Swing Out Sister. Here's what she built after that, a career that has never really stopped. Producer credits, entrepreneurial ventures, a lasting catalog. She owns her masters, something almost no artist of her era managed to negotiate. She's been quietly one of the most successful business minds of her generation of performers, and she's done it without the tabloid chaos that consumed most of her peers. Alive today at 67. Net worth reportedly around $6 million, modest by rock star standards, significant by solo artist with full ownership standards. Rick Parfitt. He was 36 years old, status quo guitarist, the heart of a band that had been pumping out 3-chord rock and roll since the late 60s and was, by 1984, the kind of band your dad loved and you pretended not to. He brought rock credibility to that studio. He also, by most accounts, brought a significant amount of alcohol. The stories vary. Some say Rick was fine that day.
Huge ashtray full of it in the middle of the room.
Others say his bandmate Francis Rossi ended up singing what was supposed to be Rick's line because Rick was, to put it gently, in no condition. Nobody was bothered by it. It was 1984. It was a one-day charity session. Rock stars drank. That was the job. But the drinking never really stopped. Neither did the rest of it. Multiple heart attacks through the 2000s, a quadruple bypass, health crises that would have put most men in an armchair permanently. Rick kept touring with status quo anyway. He loved it too much to stop. Here's what got him in the end. Not a heart attack, sepsis. A shoulder infection that went septic after what should have been a routine injury. Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2016. Rick Parfitt died at the age of 68. Phil Collins. He was 33 years old, already a legend, the drummer who'd become a frontman when Peter Gabriel left Genesis, and had then, somehow, improbably, become one of the biggest solo stars on earth. When he walked into Sarm West Studios, he didn't ask anyone to set up his drum kit for him. He did it himself. Sat down on the floor, tuned the snare, adjusted the cymbal heights, got the sound he wanted. Take me home. One of the biggest drummers in the world, acting like a session musician on his first paying gig. That was Phil Collins in 1984. Quiet professional, no ego. See, I remember all the time. Just show me where to sit and what to play. Here's what the following 40 years did to him. The solo career went nuclear. In the Air Tonight, Against All Odds, an Oscar, the Disney soundtracks, the kind of success that buys private islands. He had the highest grossing tour in the world at one point. And then, slowly, the body started to fail. Back injuries from decades of drumming, nerve damage, a hand that couldn't grip drumsticks anymore. By the mid-2010s, Phil Collins,
on my hands, legs, you know, it's and I don't want to be a caricature of
the man who'd personally set up his kit at Band-Aid, couldn't physically play the drums. When Genesis did their final tour in 2021, his son Nick sat in on drums while Phil sang from a chair. Alive today at 75, net worth over 200 million pounds, retired from touring.
I know. Unfortunately, none of it's true.
According to every recent interview, at peace with what the body took from him. His voice is on the 2024 Ultimate Mix, a reminder that the drummer who set up his own kit is still, quietly, the rhythm underneath all of it. John Taylor. He was 24 years old, the bassist of Duran Duran, one of the prettiest men in pop music, in a band full of pretty men.
Yes.
Allora, no, ha detto...
And by 1984, the faces of Duran Duran were on more teenage girls' bedroom walls than anyone except maybe Michael Jackson. Duran Duran showed up to Band-Aid as a unit, stylish, famous, cameras on them before they even walked in the door. John Taylor was the heartthrob, the bassist that girls wrote letters to, the face that launched 1,000 magazine covers. Here's what happened after the cameras turned off. Addiction. Serious, years-long addiction that went undiscussed publicly for a long time. John Taylor spent most of the late 1980s and early 1990s fighting heroin and alcohol in ways that would have
a bit harder to get drugs, but alcohol in our country is everywhere.
Ended lesser careers. He got sober in 1994. He's been sober since, more than 30 years now. Most of his fans never knew. He didn't make a public spectacle of it. He got clean, stayed clean, and quietly kept making music. Duran Duran never broke up permanently. They've reunited, broken up, reunited again, and are in their 5th decade of activity. John Taylor is still their bassist. He married, had children, wrote a memoir, and built a life that bears almost no resemblance to the one that nearly ended him. 65 years old in 2026, net worth over 40 million pounds. Proof that the most famous face in the room isn't always the one in the most trouble, and that some men get to rewrite the second half of the story. There was another bassist in that studio, from an Irish rock band that was, at the time, still a few years away from ruling the world. Adam Clayton. He was 24 years old, Irish by upbringing, English by birth, and the bassist of a band called U2 that was, in November 1984, considered promising but not yet mythic.
And it wasn't that I could draw particularly, but I could represent myself in art class.
Their album, The Unforgettable Fire, had just come out. Pride in the Name of Love was a hit, but nobody yet called them the biggest band in the world. That was still a few years away. Adam Clayton was the quietest member. Bono did the talking. The Edge did the guitar work. Larry Mullen had his own quiet cool. Adam just played bass, and did it beautifully, and stayed out of the headlines, mostly. Then, in the late 80s and through the 90s, Adam's drinking became its own story. He was the one U2 member who struggled publicly with alcohol, and he was open about it when he finally got sober in the mid-1990s. He stayed.
The culture of music and rock and roll
Most men who get sober from that level of addiction lose the career. Adam kept his. He kept playing. He's still U2's bassist today. And in 2026, the band is still performing, still recording, still headlining. Alive today at 66. Net worth over 100 million pounds. Quiet, married, a father, a man who seems, by every available measure, genuinely at peace. There was one more veteran in that studio, a man who, even in 1984, was already being referred to as a legend, and he took the humblest role of all of them. Sting. He was 33 years old, the frontman of The Police, who had just released Synchronicity the previous year, the album that had dethroned Michael Jackson's Thriller at #1. He was arguably the biggest rock frontman in the world that weekend, and Geldof gave him a harmony line. Background vocal, not a solo, not a hero moment, just sing with the group. Sting said yes without hesitation, stood in the back with the other singers, never asked for more. By most accounts, that was the whole point of the session for him. Leave the ego at the door, serve the song. Here's what the 40 years after that did. The Police broke up the following year. Sting's solo career went astronomical. Jazz-inflected rock records that sold by the tens of millions. Film soundtracks, musicals, humanitarian work that made his Band-Aid contribution look like a warm-up.
Favorite action movie?
The Magnificent Seven.
And the money. Sting's net worth is north of 550 million pounds. 550 million. He owns vineyards in Tuscany, a country estate in Wiltshire, and has publicly said his children will not inherit his fortune. They'll have to earn their own. Alive today at 74. Married to Trudy Styler since 1992. Still touring, still recording. Still the same composed professional who stood in the back in 1984 and sang Harmony for a Cause.
While the numbers lit it down.
His voice is on the 2024 mix. And then there were the girls, who arrived at the session in possibly the most unglamorous way any supergroup member ever arrived anywhere. Karen Woodward and Sarah Dallin, Bananarama. The limousines rolled up to Sarm West all morning. Duran Duran's limo, Culture Club's limo, Phil Collins driven in, Sting chauffeured, Concorde jets and black cars and photographers lining the street. And then, sometime in the middle of it all, a small Volkswagen pulled up, and out stepped two women from Bristol. Karen Woodward, 23, and Sarah Dallin, 22, the core of the pop trio Bananarama, who had driven themselves to the biggest recording session in British music history in a compact car. No limo, no management entourage, just the two of them, a Volkswagen, and a willingness to sing whatever Geldof told them to sing. They became arguably the most quietly successful girl group in British pop history. Through the mid-80s, Venus went to #1 in America. I Heard a Rumor charted worldwide. They outlasted every girl group that was supposed to replace them. Siobhan Fahey left the lineup. They kept going as a duo. 40 years later, Bananarama is still active. Karen and Sarah still tour together. They're still best friends. They've been best friends since they were schoolgirls in Bristol, which means their friendship has outlasted marriages, children, decades of the music industry, and most of the men on this list. Both alive today at 65. Both have children. Both still perform. The Volkswagen is long gone. The friendship isn't. Martin Kemp. He was 23 years old, Spandau Ballet's bassist, younger brother of Gary Kemp, who wrote the band's hits. And in 1984, Spandau
Best days for us, obviously. It's the first time I've ever gone on stage.
Ballet was at the absolute peak of its new romantic powers. True had been a transatlantic #1 the previous year, and the band was arriving at Band-Aid as pop royalty. Here's what nobody knew about Martin Kemp in 1984. He was fine. Perfectly healthy. The tumors came later. In 1995, Martin Kemp was diagnosed with 2 brain tumors. He had surgery, then radiation, then the seizures, the weight loss, the recovery that took years. For most of the late 90s, he was not a pop star. He was a patient. And then, slowly, he came back, but not as a musician, as an actor. He took the role of Steve Owen in the BBC soap EastEnders, and
If anything that I've ever made, I wait to see their face and their reaction.
it became one of the most iconic villain performances in British television history. He won awards. He got his second career. Today, Martin Kemp is 64 years old, married to his wife Shirley since 1988, a father, a television presenter, a reunited Spandau Ballet member, and a survivor twice over. Net worth somewhere between 10 and 20 million pounds, still working. The last name on this list was the boldest of all of them, and he's been fighting quietly for his life since the 1980s, and winning. Holly Johnson. He was 24 years old, the frontman of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. In 1984, his band had 3 consecutive #1 singles in the UK. Relax, Two Tribes, The Power of Love. Make love your... No British act had done that since Jerry and the Pacemakers in 1963. He recorded a spoken message on the Band-Aid B-side. Do they know it's Christmas? A few seconds of his voice sandwiched between everyone else's on the flip side of the single. Then came the lawsuit. Holly left Frankie Goes to Hollywood. The label sued him. The legal battles consumed years, and then in 1991, Holly Johnson announced publicly that he was HIV positive. You're a golden heart, you're the highest. He was one of the very first mainstream British pop stars to disclose his status. In 1991, an HIV diagnosis was still widely considered a death sentence. Holly Johnson should not, by the medical expectations of that era, still be alive today. He is, 35 years later. He stopped making pop music for long stretches, turned to painting, became a serious visual artist whose work has been exhibited in galleries, wrote his memoirs, continued to advocate for HIV awareness through every year of new treatment breakthroughs. Alive today at 66. Quietly creative, still with his longtime partner.
What about this one?
Still making art. Proof that the man who spoke for a few seconds on the B-side has
My vision for Frankie Goes to Hollywood
outlived almost every expectation anyone ever had for him.